And could we, given that this is a short workshop, could we move right into the workshop?
Barbara, ready to go? Yeah.
Yep.
Mrs. Stoddard? Yep. Any objections to moving right into the workshop, given that it's a quick one? Okay. Ms. Stoddard, thank you so much.
You are welcome. So I'm going to hopefully share my screen. I believe that the workshop materials are also in a folder for you. I think Anne put those up there.
They're all on board docs on this agenda item.
Okay, can everybody see that? Are we good?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so this should be fairly brief. This is an agenda of what I'm just going to run through tonight. So you saw that there was a board memo that was included as part of the package for the first read tonight. We're going to be asking the board to approve updated contract language for one article in the PEA contract, and that will happen at the January 5th board meeting. So I think most people are familiar or at least aware of our standard process for contract negotiations that occur on a rolling cycle every few years when a current contract expires. Tonight, we're going to share a little bit of information about how we approach issues, what we say mutual interest or concern that may need to be addressed between our formal negotiations with our teachers on the PEA contract. So this process that we're going to talk about provides a more timely response to issues rather than waiting until we get to the collective bargaining agreement, our negotiations on the regular agreement. The collaborative work is done through what we call the Living Contract Committee, and this is covered by Article 27 of the PEA agreement. And finally, once we talk a little bit about the Living Contract Committee, I'll give you a brief update on the language that we're talking about bringing forward in January, which is about the lunch break for secondary level educators. So again, if you look in that folder, you'll see that you have a copy of Article 27, which outlines the makeup and the work of the Living Contract Committee. The article itself has 7 different subsections that outline how we approach the work and the makeup of the committee. It includes things that are a commitment to ongoing communication, joint problem solving, and collaboration to improve union management relations and more effective district operations. It also states that the LCC is authorized to reach tentative agreements prior to the expiration of a contract, and that any substantive amendments are going to be ratified by the association and by the Board of Education. And finally, there's more detail in that article about the composition of the committee's working processes for things like scheduling, data gathering, decision-making, and communication processes. Often the outcome of LCC work is an MOU, and that MOU would carry us until the next round of negotiations. In this case, the committee gathered data and we agreed to update contract language. The language change was ratified by the association a few weeks ago, and now it's being brought forward to be ratified by the board in January. So in this specific situation, the association came forward with an issue that came up through the middle schools regarding a lunch break for teachers. The existing contract language, and again, you'll see in that folder that there's proposed language, and in there I show the current language, and then the markup, and then the proposed language. The existing language directly addresses elementary teachers with a 30-minute duty-free lunch. For secondary educators, it simply states that they will have a lunch period free from supervisory responsibilities. when this issue was brought forward and data was collected, we learned that the implementation of the contract was inconsistent across middle schools and some high schools. The existing practices at Deering, Portland, and Paths are meeting the contractual obligation, but at our 3 middle schools in Casco Bay, it was not routinely happening 5 days a week. So the updated language provides 20 consecutive minutes of break time in the middle of the instructional day. And the new language will become effective when we return to full in-person learning, or if the hybrid model is changed and the student day is extended to the full length of a non-COVID, non-hybrid student instructional day, because we have a shortened day right now. So that's probably a lot of information to try to absorb, because I get it, there's contract language and there's proposed language. We just wanted to make you aware of sort of this collaborative body or process that exists in the contract that allows us to meet and talk about language. This is the first time in my time here that we've actually had language change that's been ratified and brought to the board. So we've done a bunch of MOUs and come to other interim agreements, but this is the first time that we've done this process. Do people have questions?
Mr. Burke.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if this is going to be, I feel like I'm going to get a groan for this question, so I apologize, but I'm going to ask it anyway. The language here makes sense. I'm curious where the practice of not having lunch with students comes into play. Because in situations I've been in, that hasn't necessarily been best practice. So I'm just curious to understand our context.
I'm not sure I understand the question. So you're wondering why teachers are not having lunch with students?
Yeah, why are we contractually ratifying that's not the practice? Or that the practice is to not have have lunch with students, excuse me.
It's giving them the right to have an unsupervised lunch. It doesn't mean that people cannot choose to have lunch with students, and many of our teachers open their classrooms when we were, prior to COVID, and have, kids in their classrooms, for breakfast, for lunch, and, I would venture to say some for dinner as well. So I don't think that this means that we're saying building relationships with students by sharing a meal with them is not a good idea. This is simply saying that, teachers should also have an opportunity to, be able to go to the bathroom without, having, an obligation on their schedule. So that's what this is really intended to be. I totally agree. And I think, many of our teachers will, by choice, eat their meals in the lunchroom with kids or have kids into their classrooms for lunch. And I see Mr. Townsend anxious to share some wisdom.
Just the practical implication is still at all 3 middle schools, teachers have regular rotations of providing lunchtime supervision and support in the cafeteria. And this doesn't necessarily impact that. It just creates, there's an implication for a master schedule change to make sure there can be windows of time within there for teachers to be able to have that personal time that's much needed. So.
Okay, great. I'm glad I asked, and I'm glad to hear those responses. Thank you both very much.
Thank you, Mr. Burke. Mr. Rodriguez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Barb, I was going to ask, you mentioned there at the end that did you say this is the first time that the Living Contract Committee brings something approved for us to consider?
Since I've started in this role, this is the first time that we've made a language change that I guess has been substantive enough for the union to ratify it with their members and have us bring it to the board to ratify. So the Living Contract Committee is doing other work, but this is the first time we've brought a language change forward for ratification.
All right. Can you, just so that the board, particularly the new board members, and I'm really thankful that we included the Living Contract Committee article on the package so we can all be familiar with it. But can you maybe just give us a couple of quick examples of what other work the Living Contract Committee is working on, and why having an agreement on, or I'm sorry, I'm losing my words. Why having them approve this and bringing it to us? What set this apart? You know, why did this come through this route versus other things that the Living Contract Committee does?
So that's two different questions. The first one I'll answer. The other big piece of work that we've been working to implement over the course of a couple of years is the transition of our teacher leader stipends. As people know, we are moving to a different structure. We did that with this new contract. We did part of that work last year, and of course the pandemic set us back significantly. And so we are still doing that work this year, and that is ongoing. And so that's, you know, we have a big committee and we have a subcommittee, and we're trying to figure out how to work through the implementation of a change like that. The contract obligated the committee to do this work around the teacher leader stipends. And I'm sorry, what was the second question about what made this language different?
I think that you just answered it, and that the contract obligated them to have this ratified. That was the difference.
So that is not the case with the lunch language. So the lunch language just came up, and we went through the process of updating the language based on, you know, data and research. And I think that, you know, my experience is we're often doing refinement and clarification of language versus changing language whole cloth. And because that usually happens during negotiations. And so a lot of times I think the conversations we have in LCC are in preparation for when the contract opens, versus moving the language ahead. And I think, I'm not exactly sure why this one came forward at this particular time.
Thank you, Mr.
I wanted to have lunch.
Superintendent, do you have any insight on why this particular one came up now from all the other things that the Living Contract Committee might do? No?
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. Ms. Russell-Better.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I guess I first just wanted to make a comment that I certainly would support, in the many years of me observing both, you know, working in schools and being a parent and being in schools, more for the younger grades, just because that's where my kids have been for a number of years. But I just can't see how we know that children need to be able to stop and have a nutritious meal and have a pause in their day. And I guess I just think, wow, for us to say to that for staff that this is important, that they have a time to pause, catch a breath, feed themselves some nutritious food, get to the bathroom, and not be like in a panicked bill to do that. I think that's a pretty small ask. So I guess I just wanted to share that support for that small bit of a pause and a breath and feeding yourself and going to the bathroom. I guess just, I don't know if Barb, if this is for you, or I know Aaron mentioned something, might have answered part of my question, but I guess I'm just, would putting this language, I guess just logistically, having the language there, would that then trigger each school to have to do the scheduling piece? I mean, that seems to be, that's what it is that really needs to happen. Is that correct? So that each staff member is able to have that space, because really it's kind of just that staff are on like every minute, so they don't have that. Is that what the big piece would be? That this would trigger the buildings to have to really implement and make certain that staff all has that 20 minutes?
Yes, and some schools have, kind of already made some adjustments to their schedules in anticipation of this, because we were working on this pre-pandemic, and so we've kind of resuscitated it here to try and get it across the finish line to be prepared for post-pandemic. So some schools have made some adjustments. Others, a couple others know that it's on the radar, that when we're back to quote unquote regular school, that'll need to be part of their schedule planning process.
Thank you. And then I guess just for me to understand, does this create a staffing issue at all? Like, I know I've just heard other situations where like planning period, having staff have those periods, does that create an issue? Or is it different in each building and circumstance? Like staff do we have staff available for this to happen? Or is it going to create any issue with staffing? That you know of?
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason that we, that we have the language that we have is that it created more of an issue in some schools than in others. And so, I think that what we did is work through and create the expectation and work with, all the stakeholders to make sure that we could meet that expectation. So I don't envision that it will have, that we have the staff to do it. It will require change in the way that we do some things.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Russell-Better, for sharing your perspective and for the good questions. Any other questions from the board? Just a reminder that this is a workshop, so you'll have an opportunity to ask any subsequent questions at our next meeting on January 5th. But if you do have, major questions between now and then, you can always flag them for me and I can connect with the superintendent and Barb. Okay, it looks like there are no further questions, Ms. Stoddard.
Thank you very much.
All right, so that concludes our workshop.